Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our series on American history. Today we're going to talk about Reconstruction. The Civil War is over, Lincoln is dead. How are we going to put this country back together? Let's get after it. So, quick recap. The 13th Amendment has been passed. Slavery is abolished under U.S. law. Much of the former Confederacy is destroyed. Their economy is in shambles. Their money is worthless. Their land is all burned up and can't be used. Thank you, Sherman. 2/3 of their transportation system is also non-functional. Thank you, Sherman. But here, think bridges, railroads. It wasn't really all just Sherman. A lot of the stuff was sabotaged moving through by the Confederates. A lot of it was blown up by the Union moving in, It's a part of war. We got to rebuild it. And the lack of slave labor has thrown their agricultural system into chaos. Nobody really knows how to properly move forward. So, we have the rise of this group called the Radical Republicans. And it's not a separate party. It's just a subsect of the Republican Party who are trying really, really hard to push new legislation through. So, what's going on here is with the passing of the 13th Amendment, slavery being abolished, that means the 3/5 compromise is null and void. That means that the South's representation is going to grow by 2/3 overnight. And now that slaves are being counted towards representation, that means the Republicans are going to have more seats in the House. Remember, the Republicans are the party of abolition. This is the party that the vast, vast majority of freedmen are going to support in the years after the Civil War. Now, the Radical Republicans have three main goals. Number one, they want to prevent former Confederate leaders from returning to power. We're going to see how poorly that goes very quickly, but that's what they want to do. They want to make the Republican Party a powerful entity in the South. They want their influence to grow beyond just freedmen. Not that they're not happy with that, but who doesn't want more power while you're in power? Human nature. And they also want to make the federal government, they want to force the federal government to help African Americans achieve equality by guaranteeing their right to vote. And that, well, there's no way to talk about it here. Let's just talk about it as we move forward. First step in this process is the creation of something called the Freedmen's Bureau. It's part of the Department of War, which today is called the Department of Defense. And it's the Freedmen's Bureau's job to, first and foremost, especially in the years very close to the end of the war, they're going to feed and clothe refugees in the South, and regardless of color. The Freedmen's Bureau is going to help white and black alike. It's going to be the work of the Freedmen's Bureau during this time period that's going to prevent mass starvation in the South. So don't think just because they're called the Freedmen's Bureau, they're only helping black people. That's not true. They're kind of helping everybody. However, their second goal in their ethos is to help formerly enslaved people find work, but not only find work, but to negotiate their labor contracts. This is going to be a time period, and we'll see it come up later when we talk about it, but freedmen are going to get taken advantage of because there aren't laws protecting workers, really anybody at this time, and they're going to find themselves in some unfortunate situations, and the Freedmen's Bureau is going to want to help with that. Immediately, there are some problems. The vast majority of Southern voters are going to try to elect former Confederate officers and leaders, and try to get them integrated into Congress as soon as possible. And that happens fairly quickly. These politicians who are now in Congress pass a bunch of laws that collectively and colloquially are known as the Black Codes. And they're designed to limit African American freedoms and rights, basically keep them in a state of legal slavery. Some states it's as bad as them being allowed to be whipped and beaten. They don't have the same self-defense or any really human rights in some places. So some solutions are brought to the table fairly quick for some of this stuff. So with all of the problems that we talked about on the last slide, this is going to cause a lot of fairly moderate Republicans to join the radical Republicans in trying to get a lot of legislature passed fairly quickly. And the first thing that comes along is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And this is going to be kind of the precursor to the 14th Amendment. But we need this kind of stepping stone first. So what this does is grants citizenship to all persons born in the U.S. with the exception of Indians or Native Americans. Yes, I see the irony in that. The reasoning behind that could be an entire episode on its own. We're going to kind of gloss over it today. But the important part of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is it allowed African Americans to own property. This is a huge deal. And the problems in the Civil Rights Act get rectified in the 14th Amendment, which gets put forth, not totally ratified, but put forth shortly thereafter. And this grants citizenship to all persons in the U.S. It declares that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. This is where due process comes from. This is secured in your 14th Amendment right. And then shortly thereafter, the 15th Amendment is also put forth, and this guarantees the right to vote regardless of race. Now, importantly, you got to remember it doesn't allow everyone to vote, doesn't guarantee the right for everyone to vote, just men, but it's all men, regardless of race. So steps in the right direction, but it won't be for another several decades that we have sweeping legislation that allows everyone to vote. However, we will see in a lot of Western territories, women do have the right to vote far before they have that federal right guaranteed in the Constitution. Anyways, we have Andrew Johnson is in office. Remember, he was Lincoln's VP. Lincoln gets assassinated. Andrew Johnson takes office. And he has this model for how he thinks he wants to reintegrate the South. And here it is. I got the three most important bullet points on here. Number one, he wants each former Confederate state to revoke their declarations of secession, which I suppose makes sense. Seems kind of a little bit petty to me, considering they all signed peace treaties, but regardless. He wants them to all ratify the 13th Amendment, which makes sense. And he wants them to reject all of their Civil War debts, which is a little peculiar. This is going to put those states in a very weird spot. Remember that the only outside sources of supplies during the war for the Confederacy were France and Britain. They're kind of a big deal during this time period. And just telling them, yeah, too bad, I'm not allowed to pay you back is going to cause some issues here. We'll see that moving forward. And just remember, this is the same time period, with Johnson putting all this stuff forward, that the South is also electing former Confederate leaders to office. So they're immediately going to oppose all of this, so just keep that in mind as we move forward. What Johnson really wants is a Democrat majority in Congress. He doesn't like the 14th Amendment. He sort of attacks it. He is not, long story short, he's not in favor of it. He wants a Democrat majority in Congress so that they can kind of kick this can down the road. And Republicans respond largely in the media, what media there was at the time, and they accuse Democrats of being traitors and starting the Civil War and a bunch of stuff like that, which isn't entirely untrue, but is a little childish. But just know that politics have always been this ridiculous. Military Reconstruction starts in 1867. Nobody likes Johnson's plan. Everybody knows it's kind of dumb and a little bit childish. So, before the Republicans lose their hold on Congress, they pass this thing called the Military Reconstruction Act. And it wipes out Johnson's model, throws it right out the window. and it divides the former Confederacy into 5 districts. You can see them on the map here in those different colors. And you're going to say, hey, where the heck is Tennessee? Why is Tennessee not in any of these districts? Well, Tennessee took it upon themselves, and of their own volition, they ratified the 14th Amendment in 1866. So they kind of get out of this little bit of trouble. They don't have to be part of this military reconstruction because they did what the government wanted them to do without being forced to do it. And under this new military reconstruction, all of these states in these different zones have to do, they have to draft a new constitution which has to do 2 things. It has to guarantee all male citizens their right to vote regardless of race, and also has to ratify the 14th. So we're getting new constitutions for the South, and we're going to guarantee naturalization for everybody. If you've ever heard that term before, that's where it comes from. The 14th Amendment is often referred to as naturalization. I gotta bring up some boring politics here, just to kind of give you some context for what's going to happen next. So bear with me here. I'll try to make it as least boring as possible. With the military now in charge of Reconstruction, it's important that the Secretary of War, all of the military's boss, is agreeing with what Congress is trying to do. Secretary of War at the time is a guy named Edwin Stanton. And he's happy to enforce these policies. He thinks they're good things. Congress is very weary of Johnson. They know that he was not in support of the 14th Amendment. He kind of tried to sabotage it, and they think he's going to sabotage more legislation that they put forward. And they think he's going to do it by firing Stanton, who is working with them. So in order to stop Johnson from firing Stanton, Congress passes this thing called the Tenure of Office Act. And it's really just a fancy way to say that if there is a government position that required Senate approval for the person to be in that position, to remove that person from that position, you also need Senate approval for that. So, here's X position, and, John Doe wants it. Senate approves John Doe to get in that office. And then now, okay, we don't want him there anymore. The Senate has to approve John Doe being removed from that office. How that applies here is Johnson immediately fires Stanton on February 1st of 1868. Stanton, knowing something is about to go down, he locks himself in his office for a couple days. House of Representatives get together. They vote to impeach Johnson because he violated this new Tenure of Office Act. And they needed a 2/3 vote to get him out. The Senate, however, they voted 35-19 that he was guilty. That is 1 vote short of what they needed for a conviction. And the dissenting opinion here is basically that they didn't want to set a precedent, basically, for impeaching any president that just disagrees with Congress. They didn't want that to be the norm going forward. Regardless of how they felt about Johnson, a lot of people who voted nay just didn't want that to become an American norm in politics. However, lucky for everybody, Johnson does not run for re-election. Unfortunate for a lot of other people. With Johnson not running for election, I don't know what, I got ahead of myself here. With Johnson not running for re-election, the Republicans remain in charge, and there are Union troops in the South, and that's kind of a good thing. They are basically an occupying force. They are there for a lot of different reasons, but one of the really good ones is protecting freedmen. There would have been a lot of voter intimidation by white Southerners toward freedmen trying to vote had the military not been there to stop it. And because so many freedmen were going to the polls, when Johnson doesn't run for re-election, this results in a landslide Republican victory for Ulysses S. Grant. So things are moving up for the most part. Some vocab I want to touch on before we move forward because it's going to come up a couple times. Carpetbagger. If you've seen some Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns, you've heard that term before, Mr. Carpetbagger. A carpetbagger is simply someone from the north who goes to the south to exploit the economic conditions there. Remember, we said their land was cheap, their labor was cheap. People with money from the north go to the south to buy up that cheap land and use that cheap labor. Scalawag sounds more like a pirate term than a proper history term. However, it was used, and it's a derogatory term for Southerners who worked with Republicans and supported Reconstruction. Basically, they were seen as traitors by their fellow Southerners. So keep that in mind as we move forward. These words are going to come up a couple more times. With that said, there are a lot of African American advances during this time. They take jobs at all levels of government, including several Senate seats. Their churches expand, and they are allowed freedoms that, quite frankly, a lot of us take for granted today, and things you wouldn't think about unless they were taken away from you. They were allowed to get together. They were allowed to have social gatherings and parties and festivals and courts, and they were allowed to do normal people things that would have gotten them in some serious trouble had they tried that in the years before. I mean, you got to understand, prior to the Civil War, slaves were not allowed to gather together. They were not allowed to hold their own churches. They could not have social gatherings. They couldn't do any of that stuff. So it's during this time period that a lot of that stuff flourishes, which is, I think, a part that doesn't get talked about and a part that should be appreciated, because I think those are freedoms that a lot of people take for granted, for sure. Anyways, during Reconstruction, there's also the public school system gets set up. Very, again, long story short. And this applies to all American children. But in terms of African American advances, almost 40% of all African American children are attending public school during this time period. And that is huge. Literacy rates are going to go up a lot. You got to remember, this is only a couple years after the war. This is not even a generation removed from slavery. This is the slavery generation. This is a very, very big deal. And during this time period, a lot of black colleges are founded. Fisk, Howard, the Hampton Institute, several others that are still very much around today. Some downsides. All of these advances that are going good are not sitting well with a lot of Democrats and former Confederates. They get together and form the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, and their goal is to drive out carpetbaggers, intimidate freedmen voters, intimidate Republican voters, basically an informal way to gain control of the South. They're going to do everything they can to disrupt what the Republicans are doing during this time period. I am now noticing that R in Republican should be capitalized. Don't judge me. They're going to drive out members of the Freedmen's Bureau. They're going to burn African American homes, schools, churches. This is where the stereotype of the angry white Southerner comes from. It's this time period and this group of people. The KKK is going to become the quasi-military, like paramilitary enforcement wing of the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party is going to lean pretty hard on the KKK, we're going to see moving forward. And they're like their enforcers, for lack of a better term. Grant's second term and the scandals that are going on. So we had a fairly good first term. We talked about all those advances. That's mostly happening during Grant's first term. He has three fairly large things that happen during his second term, and they all make him look bad. To be fair, Grant himself wasn't really a bad guy. I mean, he was definitely a drinker, but he wasn't necessarily corrupt. However, a lot of the people around him certainly were. So first and foremost, During the war, the Union passed some things. They were emergency taxes. They were nicknamed the sin taxes because of the things that they taxed: alcohol, tobacco, gambling, a bunch of stuff like that. And it was basically to fund the war, and when the war was over, they were supposed to be repealed. And they never were repealed because governments don't give up power that they gained. That's just how that works. We'll see it again with the income tax in World War I when we get there. Anyways, people are very upset about this. They feel like they shouldn't be paying this tax. The government promised it was going to go away. Didn't go away. Second thing, Grant's Secretary of War, a guy named William Belknap, he gets caught accepting a bunch of bribes from army merchants in the West. He gets impeached. Not looking good for Grant. And then Grant's private secretary, a guy named Orville Babcock, again, another very long story short, he gets involved in something called the Whiskey Ring, in which the government gets cheated out of millions in tax dollars because of loopholes that are exploited by people who found out about the loopholes from Babcock. So Grant isn't looking great in his second term. And a lot of that is going to roll into the end of Reconstruction. The end of Reconstruction is actually going to start with the Panic of 1873. And one of the largest banking firms in the North, they close. They default on everything. Basically, they made a series of really bad deals and came out on the bottom every single time. And a lot of smaller local banks who were heavily invested and depended on that larger banking firm, they also close. And this causes the stock market to crash. So if that weren't bad enough, we have all of the things that are going on with Grant's second term. And this is making the Republicans look bad. Remember, Grant is a Republican, and now it looks like they're all corrupt. So this allows the Democrats to take a very, very easy win of a bunch of midterm elections, and they take control of Congress. Now, the people who have the majority in Congress don't want to enforce any of the laws that have been passed in the last 10 years, so they don't. And by the time, a few years later, 1877 rolls around, basically all of the legislation that had been passed by the radical Republicans since the end of the war was either repealed or just being ignored. They didn't care. They were in power. Who was going to get them in trouble? It didn't matter. So all of that work right down the drain. During this time period, we see a lot of changes in the South, and it gets nicknamed the New South. Southerners aren't dumb. They've realized that without slavery, they can't go back to the way that their economy was working before. They need to industrialize. They base their economy on what the North's was before the war. A lot of the iron and steel industry explodes because we're rebuilding bridges and railroads. By the time 1890 rolls around, which to be fair is well after Reconstruction, but just keep in mind, by the time 1890, 40,000 miles of railroads are crisscrossing just the South. If you remember, just a couple of episodes ago, there were 30,000 miles of railroad in the U.S. as a whole. Now there's more than that simply just in the South. And it's not that in the New South agriculture goes away, it just doesn't take quite the front seat anymore. So there's definitely still tobacco farms, cotton farms, all of that stuff. But now, in addition to that, there are mills and processing plants that are becoming commonplace. And remember, it used to be that the South just grew the stuff and then they would ship it up to the North, and that's where it would get processed. Well, now it's being processed in the South as well. That's creating a lot of jobs, and it allows the expansion of the economy to remain in the South, the rebuilding and the jobs and all of the economic input to remain in the South, and this is really good. This is what we would call like vertical integration today. And the industrial age has finally made its way to the South with all of that. It only took like an extra 50 years as opposed to the North. Some things don't change, however, despite the name the New South. With Democrats in power, they pull that standing army of Union troops out of the South. This means that there's no one to protect the freedmen going to vote. That allows the KKK to have a massive foothold in the South and to do all of the terrible things that we just talked about them doing. For the people themselves, for the freedmen themselves, unfortunately, most of the time they're forced back into hard labor, agricultural labor, with bad wages, with bad conditions. A lot of them become tenant farmers and sharecroppers, and then take on debts or liens, and those debts and liens keep them attached to the land. They end up in a state that is, in practice, not very different from slavery at all. And segregation also takes a foothold during this time period. These are a set of laws where the South is trying to get around the 15th Amendment. A lot of them impose poll taxes, so when you go to vote, you have to pay a tax to vote. And it was set at a price that they knew a lot of white people could afford and a lot of black people couldn't. States who didn't do that often did a literacy test, so you had to take a test to find out how literate you were, and if you failed the test, then you couldn't vote. And we just talked about, this is still the generation of slavery. The vast majority of them were not literate. And a lot of the time there were two separate literacy tests. There was a white one and a black one, and I'll let you guess which one was harder. And despite all of that stuff being, enforced on African Americans, freedmen, a lot of southern states just didn't enforce those requirements on white people. This is the beginning of Jim Crow laws. And these are laws that enforce the separation of the races. This is where segregation is going to come from. This is status quo in the South for the next 100 years or so. It is going to separate the races in all aspects of life. The stereotypical bus seat or train car seat to restaurants, hotels, railroads, where you can stand in a public park. Every single aspect of life is segregated in the South, and in some places in the North too. I don't want you guys to think it was just in the South, or racism was just in the South. It was still very much alive in the North. And Plessy v. Ferguson. Big deal. It's going to set a precedent for how a lot of things get looked at moving forward. So Homer Plessy is a black man. He gets arrested for riding in a whites-only train car. Over several years, he appeals his case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the very famous ruling is separate but equal. Having separate facilities is not unconstitutional. So, in other words, it's not that we don't have a black train car, it's just that the train car for black passengers is separate from the white train car. So this was the norm. This was standard operating procedure going forward. The government ruled that the races did not have to be integrated so long as there were facilities for both. And this is like I said, this is how the South is going to be, and legally until 1968, but in practice, even decades or more longer than that. And this is where we're going to end for today. I'm going to end on Plessy v. Ferguson, the early 1890s. We covered about 30 years here. Is a fairly large time period, and there is a lot of other stuff going on in the U.S. during this time period. But I didn't want to jumble it all into one. I wanted to keep all the stuff that had to do with Reconstruction kind of all together, and then in our next episode we will go back through those same roughly 30 years and see what else was going on as well. Other than that, thanks for coming out, and I'll catch you in the next one.